Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR official 24 channel. Matt ordered Annie to eliminate Sienna in a moment that would later be remembered not simply as a command but as the precise second when every carefully balanced lie, every buried secret, and every fragile alliance began to tilt toward inevitable collapse, because the words themselves were deceptively simple yet saturated with history, fear, and ruthless calculation, spoken in a low voice that carried the weight of years of manipulation and survival, and as Annie stood across from him, absorbing the order, she understood instantly that this was not merely about silencing an enemy but about erasing a living embodiment of truths that threatened to destroy Matt's entire constructed world, a world built on half-confessions, blood ties twisted into weapons, and loyalties bought with guilt rather than trust, for Sienna was never just Sienna, never just a woman who had infiltrated their lives wearing a mask of charm and vulnerability, but a walking fuse connected directly to secrets Matt had sworn would never see the light of day, secrets about Cassie, about Sharon, about the shadowed experiments of identity and control that defined the Dark Alliance, and as Matt spoke, his eyes betrayed the conflict raging beneath his cold exterior, because part of him still remembered the man he once was before power taught him that mercy was a liability, before he learned that love could be leveraged and blood could be rewritten, and Annie, ever the consummate operative, recognized that hesitation instantly, even as she nodded in acceptance, because she knew Matt well enough to understand that when he used the word eliminate, he meant more than death, he meant finality, an end so absolute that no trace of Sienna's influence, memory, or truth would remain, and yet Annie also knew that Sienna's existence had already carved itself too deeply into too many hearts to be erased so cleanly, especially Victor's, especially Sharon's, and perhaps even Annie's own, though she would never admit that aloud. And as she turned away to carry out the order, the corridors of the compound seemed to close in around her, each step echoing with the reminder that she was no longer merely an instrument of Matt's will but a witness to the unraveling of everything he claimed to control, because Sienna's mask had already been torn away, her confession to being Cassie had already detonated like a psychic bomb, and the image of her calling Sharon Mommy lingered in the air like a ghost that refused to be banished, and Matt knew this, which was why he issued the order with such urgency, because as long as Sienna breathed, the truth breathed, and truth was the one enemy he could never fully defeat, only delay, and Annie's task was to delay it one final time, to silence the living reminder that the Dark Alliance was built not on destiny or necessity but on stolen lives and rewritten identities. And yet as Annie prepared herself, checking weapons, rehearsing contingencies, mapping exits, she could not ignore the growing doubt tightening in her chest, the question she had avoided for years finally demanding an answer. At what point does obedience become complicity in a lie so monstrous that it consumes everyone it touches, including the ones who think they are in control? And Sienna, unaware of the precise timing of the blade being sharpened for her, sensed the shift nonetheless, because she had lived too long under false names not to recognize the tremor of impending betrayal. And as she moved through her own memories, replaying the moment her mask fell, the shock in Sharon's eyes, the disbelief in Victor's voice, she realized that Matt's reaction would never be forgiveness or understanding but annihilation, because men like Matt do not undo their mistakes, they destroy the evidence, and in that realization, Sienna's fear transformed into something sharper, something resolute, because if she was going to be eliminated, she would not go quietly. Not without ensuring that the truth she carried would find another vessel, another voice, another moment to explode into the open, and this possibility haunted Matt even as he returned to his desk, even as he surrounded himself with monitors and guards and protocols, because power had taught him to anticipate threats but not how to silence the guilt that gnawed at him when he remembered Cassie as she was meant to be, not as the weaponized identity he helped forge, and Annie, moving ever closer to her target, felt the weight of that guilt pressing on her too, because she had been present for so many of the Alliance's sins that the line between right and wrong had long since blurred into a single directive, survive, but Sienna's story complicated that directive, because survival built on erasure demanded a price that even Annie was no longer sure she could pay, and as the distance between hunter and target closed, the narrative Matt believed he controlled began to fracture, because Victor was already suspicious, Sharon was already grieving a daughter she had just found and was about to lose again, and the ripple effects of Sienna's existence were spreading faster than Annie could contain, turning Matt's decisive order into an act of desperation rather than strength, and in that sense, the command to eliminate Sienna was less an assertion of dominance and more a confession of fear that the truth, once revealed, could not be stuffed back into the darkness, fear that the Alliance's carefully curated mythos would crumble under the weight of a single woman insisting on her real name, and as Annie finally came face to face with Sienna, the air between them heavy with unspoken understanding, both women knew that this moment was bigger than either of them, bigger even than Matt, because it represented the crossroads where obedience and conscience collided, where secrets demanded either burial or revelation, and whether Annie pulled the trigger or lowered the weapon, the outcome would reshape every life bound to the Dark Alliance, because Sienna's elimination would not erase the truth, only martyr it, and sparing her would ignite a war Matt could no longer control, and somewhere deep down, even Matt understood that, which was why his order echoed with such finality, because he knew it was the last command he could issue before the story slipped entirely out of his hands, transforming him from architect to antagonist in a narrative driven no longer by his designs but by the relentless, unstoppable force of truth fighting its way into the light. The moment stretched far beyond the space it occupied, expanding into something almost unbearable as Annie and Sienna stood locked in silence, the weight of Matt's order hovering between them like an unseen third presence, because even without words Sienna understood why Annie was there and Annie understood that Sienna already knew, and in that mutual recognition there was a strange, devastating intimacy. One forged not by friendship but by shared entrapment within Matt's machinery, and it was in that charged stillness that the true consequence of the command to eliminate began to reveal itself, because elimination was not simply an act of violence but an attempt to impose a definitive ending on a story that had stubbornly refused to end, and as Annie raised her weapon, she found herself remembering all the other times she had followed orders without hesitation, all the names that had faded into nothing once the job was done, and yet none of them had ever looked at her the way Sienna did now, with a mixture of fear, defiance, and an almost painful clarity, as if Sienna were seeing not an assassin but a woman who had been making compromises for so long she no longer remembered the first one, and that look fractured something inside Annie, because it forced her to confront the truth that Matt's authority over her had never been absolute, only convenient, sustained by routine and rationalization rather than genuine belief, and in that fracture, doubt rushed in. Accompanied by memories she had tried to bury, memories of Cassie as a child laughing before the Alliance ever marked her as an asset, memories of Sharon's grief manipulated into compliance, memories of Victor's loyalty slowly curdling into suspicion, all converging now in the figure of Sienna, who embodied every lie they had told themselves about necessity and survival. Sienna, for her part, felt the inevitability pressing down on her like gravity, yet beneath the fear there was a fierce resolve, because she had already lost her name once, already been erased and rewritten, and she refused to allow that erasure to be completed by a bullet in the dark, and so she spoke, quietly at first, then with growing strength, not pleading but asserting, reminding Annie that Matt's world was already collapsing whether Sienna lived or died, that the truth had a momentum of its own, that Sharon's recognition could not be undone, that Victor's doubts would only sharpen in the face of another disappearance, and as those words landed, Annie felt their accuracy cut deeper than any accusation, because she knew that Matt's strategy had always relied on isolating threats, on removing individuals one by one, never accounting for the way truths connected people, never acknowledging that every elimination left behind questions, grief, and suspicion that compounded rather then vanished, and in that realization Annie saw the flaw that Matt himself could not see, blinded as he was by his belief that control equaled safety. Meanwhile, Matt paced his private office, watching feeds that showed nothing out of the ordinary yet feeling a tightening in his chest that no amount of security could ease, because issuing the order had not brought him the relief he expected, only a hollow anticipation tinged with dread, and as he replayed the moment Sienna's mask had fallen in his mind, he was haunted not by her defiance but by Sharon's voice, by the way it had broken when she said Cassie's name, and for an instant he allowed himself to imagine an alternate reality in which he had chosen differently, in which he had told the truth years earlier, in which Cassie had grown up without the weight of lies pressing down on her identity, and that imagining was intolerable, because it threatened to expose the fact that his choices had not been forced but selected, chosen again and again because they preserved his power, And so he clung to the order he had given, telling himself that once Sienna was gone the noise would fade. The narrative would stabilize, and the alliance would endure. But outside his sealed room, the effects of Sienna's revelation continued to ripple outward, because Sharon was no longer the pliable ally Matt believed her to be, her grief now sharpened by certainty rather than doubt, and Victor's loyalty was cracking under the strain of unanswered questions, each silence from Matt confirming what words never could, that something monstrous had been hidden in plain sight, and as these tensions escalated, the alliance's operative sensed the shift, the subtle change in atmosphere that always preceded collapse, and whispers began to circulate, connecting fragments of information into a picture that no amount of elimination could fully erase. Back in the confrontation, Annie found herself lowering her weapon slightly, not as an act of mercy but as an acknowledgement of reality, because killing Sienna would not restore order, it would ignite chaos, and Sienna saw that shift and pressed forward, not with threats but with truth, explaining that she had already set contingencies in motion, that evidence existed beyond her body, that voices would speak even if hers was silenced, and whether or not this was entirely true mattered less than the fact that Annie believed it could be, because the Alliance had taught her better than anyone that information was a weapon that multiplied the moment it was shared, and in that instant Annie realized that Matt's command had come too late, that the elimination he sought was no longer possible in the way he imagined. This realization forced Annie to confront a choice she had avoided her entire career, a choice not between success and failure but between obedience and responsibility, and she understood that whatever she did next would define her not as an operative but as a person, because sparing Sienna would mark her as a traitor in Matt's eyes, while killing her would cement her role as an accomplice to a lie that was already consuming everyone it touched, and the weight of that choice was crushing, yet also strangely liberating, because for the first time Annie was not acting within parameters set by someone else but determining her own line, and as she stood there, she felt the accumulated weight of every elimination she had carried out, every justification she had accepted, converging into a single, unavoidable reckoning. Elsewhere, Sharon confronted Matt directly, her composure shattered but her resolve unyielding, demanding answers he had always withheld, and in her eyes he saw something he could not manipulate or intimidate, because grief had stripped her of fear, and as she spoke Cassie's name aloud again and again, it echoed through the corridors of his mind, undermining the authority he clung to, and for the first time Matt sensed that his power was no longer unilateral, that the narrative was slipping beyond his control not because of a single betrayal but because too many people were now aware of the same truth, and awareness, once shared, could not be undone. Victor, too, moved independently now, tracing patterns, following instincts honed over years of loyalty, and each discovery reinforced what he already suspected, that Matt's command structure was built on selective truth, and that Sienna's existence threatened not just one secret but the legitimacy of the entire alliance, and as Victor prepared to act, he understood that whatever happened to Sienna would be a catalyst rather than a conclusion, a spark that would either burn the alliance down or force it into the light. In the end, the irony of Matt's order was that it revealed his weakness more clearly than any confession could have, because only a man afraid of the truth would seek to eliminate it so desperately, and that fear permeated everything he touched, infecting his operatives, his allies, and even his enemies, turning what he believed was a decisive move into the final acceleration toward collapse. And as Annie made her decision, as Sienna braced herself for the consequences, as Sharon and Victor closed in from different directions, the command to eliminate ceased to be an instruction and became a symbol, the last gasp of a system built on secrecy, control, and denial, a system that could not survive the simple act of someone insisting on being seen for who they truly were, because whether Sienna lived or died, the truth she represented had already escaped containment, and in that sense Matt's order had failed the moment he spoke it, transforming from an assertion of power into a silent admission that the story was no longer his to dictate, that the darkness he had relied upon was thinning, and that the alliance, like every structure built on lies, was finally being forced to confront the light. The hours that followed unfolded with a relentless intensity, as if time itself had accelerated in response to the fracture Matt's order had created, because once the command to eliminate Sienna existed in the open, even if only among a handful of people, it began to exert a gravitational pull on every decision, every movement, every hidden allegiance within the alliance, drawing them all toward an unavoidable convergence, and Annie felt that pull acutely as she escorted Sienna through a series of maintenance corridors rather than toward the execution point she had originally mapped, a deviation so small on the surface yet so monumental in consequence that it sent a tremor of both fear and resolve through her, because she knew that from this moment forward there would be no returning to the comfortable fiction of obedience, and Sienna, recognizing the significance of Annie's choice, allowed herself a single breath of relief before replacing it with vigilance, because survival now depended not on trust but on momentum, on staying one step ahead of Matt's tightening net. As they moved, Annie's mind raced through contingencies, calculating how long it would take Matt to realize that the elimination was not proceeding as ordered, how quickly he would reassign resources, how many operatives would follow commands without question and how many might hesitate, and in those calculations she saw clearly for the first time how brittle the alliance had become, how much it relied on the assumption that orders would be obeyed simply because they always had been, and that brittleness terrified her, because it meant that chaos was not an anomaly but an inevitability, waiting only for the right trigger, and Sienna, sensing Annie's internal conflict, spoke again, not to persuade but to anchor, reminding her that choices made under pressure revealed the truths people tried hardest to deny, and Annie understood that this was her truth now, that she could no longer pretend ignorance or neutrality. Matt, alerted by subtle discrepancies in the system, felt the first real spike of panic cut through his carefully maintained composure, because he recognized the signs of deviation, the tiny delays and altered paths that signaled disobedience, and as he demanded updates, his voice sharpened with an edge of fury that could no longer be disguised as authority, and in that fury there was desperation, because he knew that if Annie had hesitated, if she had chosen to think rather than simply act, then the elimination was already compromised, and that knowledge forced him to confront the possibility he had spent years avoiding, that loyalty enforced through fear and secrecy could evaporate the moment someone glimpsed an alternative, and that alternative, embodied by Sienna's continued existence, threatened to unravel everything. Sharon, moving through her own reckoning, felt an unexpected clarity settle over her, because the chaos around her mirrored the emotional storm she had been carrying since Sienna's confession, and in that clarity she resolved that whatever the cost, she would not allow Cassie's truth to be buried again, and this resolve transformed her from a grieving mother into a force Matt could no longer dismiss, because grief had sharpened into purpose, and as she reached out to Victor, aligning their fractured understandings, she realized that the alliance's greatest vulnerability was not its enemies but the people who had believed in it, because betrayal, once internalized, carried a potency no external threat could match. Victor, piecing together fragments at a rapid pace, recognized that Annie's deviation was not an isolated incident but a symptom of a deeper shift, and he began to quietly redirect assets, positioning himself not as Matt's enforcer but as a stabilizing presence for those already questioning their place in the structure, and in doing so he crossed a line he had sworn never to approach, because it meant acting without Matt's consent, yet Victor understood that consent had lost its moral authority. The moment Matt ordered the elimination of a woman whose only true crime was existing as proof of his lies. As the net tightened, Annie and Sienna reached a temporary refuge, a place meant for equipment storage but now repurposed into a sanctuary of sorts, and there, in the dim light, Annie finally allowed herself to speak the fear she had been carrying, admitting that sparing Sienna did not guarantee survival, that it might in fact ensure a more violent reckoning, and Sienna accepted this without flinching, because she had already made peace with the idea that survival was less important than significance, that living only to be erased again would be a hollow victory, and this shared understanding forged a bond between them, not of trust but of mutual recognition, a bond rooted in the knowledge that they were now participants in shaping the outcome rather than passive victims of Matt's decisions. Matt's response, when it came, was swift and brutal, because he escalated security measures, issued secondary directives, and began framing the situation as a containment breach rather than a moral crisis, and in doing so he revealed the extent to which he was willing to sacrifice individuals to preserve the illusion of control, an illusion that was already cracking under the strain, because each escalation created new points of resistance, new opportunities for doubt to take hold, and as operatives encountered conflicting orders and incomplete explanations, they began to question not only the current situation but the foundation upon which the alliance rested. The convergence came closer with each passing minute, as paths intersected and intentions collided, and it became clear that the question was no longer whether Sienna would be eliminated but what her survival or death would represent, because she had become a symbol, a living challenge to